Hello, and welcome to another edition of BPW Transpec series of online training videos. In this series of videos, we will be taking a closer look at the critical maintenance requirements for selected BPW products. In this episode, we will be dealing with the correct maintenance requirements for BPW self-steering axles. The lubrication of the steering axle is critical to achieving the correct steer axle operation and proper component life. The BPW self-steering axles can be identified by the steering knuckle and kingpin on either side of the axle beam, which face toward the direction of travel. On the rear of the self-steering axle is a tie rod which contains the steer lock mechanism. The axle beam of the BPW self-steering axle used in Australia is solid rather than the hollow square of the standard BPW axle. The BPW self-steering axles are available with either drum brakes or the latest design disc brakes to suit your specific application. The BPW self-steering axles are fitted with the same hubs, brakes and suspensions as the standard fixed BPW axles. For use in harsh or off-road conditions, we recommend the fitment of a heavy-duty steer damper and kingpin skirts to protect the undulating wear washers. The BPW steer axle works on the same principle as the humble office chair. The center of the kingpin is in front of the center line of the axle. When the vehicle enters a turn, the sideways forces on the tires force the steering knuckles to rotate, opening up the pressure washers and compressing the return spring. This steers the BPW self-steering axle tires in the opposite direction to the truck's steering tires, effectively shortening the wheelbase and pushing the rear of the trailer away from the corner. This allows the truck and trailer combination to turn sharper corners, improving their maneuverability. After the corner, once the vehicle straightens out, the return spring above the kingpin forces the steering knuckle back down so that the pressure washers return to their closed position. This return spring maintains force on the pressure washers at all times in the forward direction, so that any unnecessary movement of the steer axle is prevented. The BPW self-steering axle works in conjunction with a fixed axle and can be used in a one-to-one combination on a dual-axle semi with a fixed axle or on a tri-axle semi with a front lift axle. The BPW self-steering axle needs to be locked before the vehicle can reverse. This is done via the locking mechanism in the middle of the tie rod. A pneumatic cylinder drives a wedge block down into a gap in the lock plate on the tie rod, preventing the tie rod from moving when you reverse. This is done via either an electrical signal sent from the activation of the reverse lights or manually by activating a stopcock on the side of the trailer. The self-steering axle can also be controlled via the onboard EBS system of the trailer. If the BPW self-steering axle is slightly turned when the lock is activated, the block may not be able to properly engage in the corresponding gap in the tie rod plate. If this occurs, the vehicle will need to be counter-steered slightly when starting to reverse, forcing the tires to rotate around the kingpin and allowing the lock block to engage. The locking mechanism is then released when the vehicle is driven forward again, either by extinguishing the reverse lights and therefore cutting the power to the steer lock, or by manually opening the stopcock. The BPW self-steering axle is also locked in order to perform a wheel alignment on the vehicle. Once the locking mechanism is engaged, the axle can be aligned just like any normal fixed BPW axle. A small steer damper fitted between the axle beam and the tie rod ensures a smooth, stable ride. The BPW self-steering axles essentially increase the radius of the turn swept by the trailer, pushing the rear of the trailer away from the corner and allowing the truck to turn tighter. This increases the vehicle maneuverability, allowing for greater access for the vehicle to load and offload. In roundabouts and tight corners, the extra maneuverability helps prevent curb strikes, reducing costly damage to wheels, tires, and infrastructure. The fact that the trailer is now easier to tow also brings huge savings in wear and tear and significantly improves fuel mileage. Tools required: a jack capable of lifting the steer axle until the wheels are clear of the ground, a manual or pneumatic grease gun filled with BPW Eco Plus long life grease. A pit is not required, but it does make the lubrication process easier. The kingpin of the steer axle is held tight in the axle beam, and the steering knuckle rotates around this kingpin on phosphor bronze bushes. These bushes at the top and bottom of the kingpin work in conjunction with the BPW Eco Plus long life grease to reduce wear and extend the operational life of the self-steering axles. It is therefore critical that these bushes be correctly lubricated at the prescribed times. Jack up the BPW self-steering axle until the tires are clear of the floor to unload the kingpins. Release the steer lock if it is engaged and thoroughly clean the area around the grease nipples and the wear washers. Open the grease nipple caps and check the grease nipples for tightness and serviceability. Now manipulate the tires on the axle to force the steer axle knuckles to rotate around the kingpins. While the knuckles are rotating, apply BPW Eco Plus long life grease to the lower grease nipple until new grease begins to emerge from the gap between the undulating wear washers, pushing the old grease out ahead of it. While continuing to rotate the kingpins, now apply BPW Eco Plus long life grease to the upper grease nipple until new grease begins to emerge from the gap between the knuckle and the axle beam, pushing the old grease out ahead of it. Stop turning the steer knuckles and allow the axle to settle back into the straight ahead position. Then lower the axle off the jacks. By rotating the kingpins during greasing, we ensure that new grease can find its way up the spiral grooves in the phosphor bronze bushes. Use a rag to wipe the excess grease off the steering knuckles, making sure that a layer of the new grease remains in the gaps between the steering knuckle and the axle beam and between the pressure washers to lubricate them and to form a barrier that prevents dirt and moisture from penetrating to the kingpin bushes. Refit the grease nipple caps. The vehicle is now ready to leave the workshop. BPW self-steering axles need to be properly greased every 4 weeks for normal road transport, or more frequently for vehicles that are subject to dirt roads or chassis or pressure washing. When using a power washer or a chassis wash to clean the undercarriage and axles of a trailer, there is a good chance that the water and soap will remove these grease layers around the kingpins. In this event, the BPW self-steering axle should immediately be re-greased in the correct manner. BPW Transpec does not recommend the use of a central lubrication system on the BPW self-steering axles. The use of a central lubrication system often leads to a situation where the kingpins are not visually checked, and it can lead to a buildup of excessive grease around the kingpin, which can result in accelerated wear to both the kingpins and the wear washers. The use of the kingpin skirts assists in maintaining undulating pressure washer lubrication in rougher conditions. At some stage, the BPW self-steering axle will reach the point where the phosphor-bronze kingpin bushers and the undulating pressure washers will be worn beyond their allowable limits and will require replacement. Failure to lubricate the kingpins in the correct manner and at the correct intervals will result in accelerated wear to the kingpin bushers and the pressure washers. Before checking the self-steering bush wear, please ensure that the bearing adjustment is correct. The kingpin bushers require replacement when the horizontal movement at the steering knuckle exceeds 1 mm. Use a dial gauge with a magnetic base to measure the movement at the kingpin when the stub axle is manipulated in the direction shown by the arrows. New pressure washers have an overall thickness of 25 mm and need to be replaced when the overall thickness drops to 22 mm. This allows for a maximum steering knuckle lift at the kingpin of 12 mm. Dropping to 9 mm when the undulating pressure washers are worn out. To assist in this check, the undulating pressure washers have wear limit indicators on them. The small U-shaped indentations and a dotted line indicate the maximum wear allowed on the undulating pressure washers. Once the U-shaped indentations and the dotted lines disappear, it is time to fit new pressure washers. The hubs, braking systems and suspensions fitted to the BPW self-steering axles are exactly the same as those fitted to standard BPW axles, and they require the same maintenance. Please consult the latest BPW Operator's Manual, available on request, or download a copy from www.bpwtransspec.com.au. The BPW Operator's Manual contains complete details of maintenance schedules and requirements. Thank you for watching this video on the operation and maintenance of BPW self-steering axles. Don't forget to watch the other BPW Transpec training videos in this series. For further assistance, contact your nearest BPW Transpec representative.